Oh, we have chat. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're going to give everybody 1 minute. This is Anne. Can you let me know in chat if you can hear me? Awesome. Thank you. That's a good sign. That means we're off to a good start. We're up to 90. We'll wait 1 more minute and then we are going to get going. Okay, and then Rita, I'll advance your slides.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And try not to make a fool out of myself going to the videos. So we'll work hard on that. All right, welcome everybody to our webinar series. My name is Ann Avery, and I'm Director for the Center of Excellence for Marine Manufacturing and Technology. We're really excited to have you all here today. This is the first of our 3 webinar series as part of the Implicit Bias Institute in Workforce Education project. And the project is led by 4 centers of excellence and the Machinist Institute. The 4 centers are maritime, careers and education, construction, agriculture, and natural resources. So we're really excited today to bring you our first webinar, an introduction to implicit bias in workforce education. Some of you I know are familiar with our lead facilitator, Dr. Rita Cameron Wedding, and we're very excited to have Dr. Wedding here today to present this webinar. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. I'm not even going to read the bio that's on the screen. I'm going to let you all do that for yourselves. But Dr. Cameron Wedding, as I said, is our lead facilitator for the Implicit Bias Project. She is also a nationally and internationally recognized expert in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion and implicit bias. Dr. Cameron Wedding works with educational providers, private companies, and associations all across the United States and all over the world. So we're thrilled to have her here. And without further ado, one more housekeeping thing for you all, though. We want to make sure that we have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you all will please put your questions in the Q&A space or chat, whatever you prefer or whatever you have access to. We will moderate the Q&A at the end of Dr. Cameron Wedding's presentation. We're also recording today's webinar, so you may access the webinar after today as well. So Dr. Cameron Wedding, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to be able to provide this presentation to you today. And I'm definitely looking forward to the Q&A because I want to hear what you think about it. I want to hear some of your ideas. And so please do not hesitate to share your thoughts with us when we get to that point. So, you know, we just did a seminar not too long ago. And what I realized when I was preparing this presentation for this webinar, I realized that unfortunately, issues related to systemic racism and implicit bias, it accumulates so quickly, I can never keep up. And so even though we just had a presentation like a couple of weeks ago in January, or maybe it was February, and I'm not sure. The material that I'm presenting you today is updated even in that short period of time. So I'm very excited about sharing this with you today. So as you can see from the first slide, we're talking about how implicit bias can impact racial disparities in workforce, faculty hiring, and all other aspects of college life. So we want you to think about this in terms of the community colleges, for example, being one of many systems. So what we see in the research and in real life is that systemic racism cuts across all systems, whether it's higher education, K through 12, housing, healthcare, and all other systems. And we even saw the data that came from, that emerged from the COVID economy demonstrated that there is definitely disproportionality in the workplace. So lots of implications. So the purpose of our conversation today is to talk about the many ways that understanding implicit bias and systemic racism can help you improve outcomes. I'm a professor at Sacramento State University, and I know that understanding implicit bias and systemic racism, even though those are the disciplines I teach, in my personal life, it has made a huge difference. Next slide, please. So this is what bias is. So you can just take a look at this slide. It's just really important for us to know that we all have biases. Doesn't mean we're bad. It means that we're human. And biases happen in a split second, and we typically don't know that we sometimes don't realize we have biases. But hopefully, as a result of this training, you will be very thoughtful. I mean, obviously some of you have attended many different implicit bias trainings, but the key thing is it takes us years, it takes us most of our lives to accumulate the biases that we have. We will spend the rest of our lives trying to deconstruct them. Next slide, please. So what we've learned is that we're all in this together. We know that, but we certainly had evidence of that as a result of the pandemic and COVID-19. And what we see is that even though we'd like to think that we have the same outcomes, we can see that race, gender, ethnicity, social class, even things that you wouldn't think would matter so much, marital status, all of those things are showing to have some tangible impact as a result of the COVID data that has been collected. Next slide, please. So when we think about the employment statistics for women of color, what we find is that women of color do not have the same recovery as a result of the pandemic. And as you can see from this data, the outcomes really vary. For white workers, the unemployment rate fell to 5.6% in February, but for Black and Hispanic workers, reported jobless rates were 9.9 and 8.5 respectively. So there's a significant difference as you can look through these bullet points to see how the disparities shape up in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender. Next slide, please. So this is why this work is so important. It's important because we don't all understand, I can make a lot of assumptions about what people know and understand about race and about disparities, but those assumptions will probably be proven to be false. During the pandemic, and some of you might remember this, we saw that not only do people have different outcomes, our understanding of the cause of those outcomes or those disparities really vary. One state senator and doctor speculated publicly, he was on the Senate Health Committee, about why the so-called colored population had been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. Asked at a hearing if the high rate of coronavirus cases of African Americans, the question he asked was, is there a disparity, with the colored population because African Americans don't wash their hands as well as other groups? Actually, I don't think he said African Americans even. I think he said the colored people don't wash their hands as well as other groups. So we have to understand that we learn these biases. We've learned these biases over time, and they can impact every decision that we make. So in the case of the the state senator who sat on the Senate Health Committee, his biases clearly would shape the decisions he would make on the Senate Health Committee. In the same way, the biases that we have wherever we sit on our campuses, whether we are faculty or we are in student services, our biases will definitely and will continue to affect the outcomes of the work that we do. So we have to be really thoughtful about how that plays out. And the other thing too, when we look at the second part of this particular slide, I just want to remind you that systemic racism, I keep referencing that, but just let me give you a definition. It's important for us to understand that systemic racism is the outcome of how policies are developed and enforced, how laws are passed, how racial narratives are deployed, and how decisions are made by everyday people just like you and me. So the work that we do, the decisions that we make will keep the system of inequality and systemic racism intact. Next slide, please. Before I go on to this slide, I want to say this. I have been doing this work for a very long time. At some point, I think I actually stopped counting. But despite the fact that I was doing this work as a college professor in the 70s, I'm still working on my biases. I'm still trying so hard to identify them, to be aware of them. And I think one of the most painful and difficult things for me was when I was in the hallway on my campus, and I actually came off the elevator and I saw a student standing at the bulletin board. And he happened to be an African-American student, but there was nothing otherwise different about him from any other student I would see looking at the bulletin board. But all of a sudden, I started to realize that my body language had shifted. I didn't just see a student, I saw a student that looked in my mind, and I have to be real clear and say, this is embarrassing for me to share, but I have to share it because it's like, if I don't pay attention to my biases, I become part of the problem rather than the solution. So as I'm standing there looking sideways at the student, looking at all the identifying features that I've been taught to identify with dangerousness or being a problem, the fact not only his skin color, but he had sagging pants, he didn't have on a belt. He had dreadlocks, he had tattoos, he had a grill, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. So in a split-second decision, I decided fear. But also in a subsequent decision, when I realized that my body language was communicating something that was not true about the student, to my knowledge, I was able to change my behavior. I was able to change my body language so I could look at the student as a student who was coming to get information, as opposed to someone who I needed to be afraid of. So I just want to make that point because I think it's really important for me to be able to be authentic and honest about the fact that when I ask you to do this work every day, this is just not a homework assignment. This is what we absolutely have to do in order for us to diminish the impact of this slide that's right before us. So when we look at this slide, what we have to come to terms with is the fact that we have constructed these disparities that we have across our system. These, most of these policies that you see here are government sanctioned. And these are the policies that basically ensured a large, secure, and white middle class. And this is by Heather McGhee, who wrote the book called The Sum of Us. Next slide, please. So I like to share this slide because it goes into detail. So I'm going to highlight at least 3 systems. I'm going to talk about the media. I'm going to talk about housing. I'm going to talk about employment. And I wanted to highlight housing because obviously it's something that all of us need to have. But I wanted you to see the slide so you could see where people were. I want you to see where my community was. If you look at the third bullet point, family homes and healthy neighborhoods with rose bushes, fruit trees, beauty salons, movie theaters. And by the 1970s, the aftermath, this was after we had done redlining for a couple of decades and restrictive housing covenants. We basically destroyed communities. I live in a house right now in Curtis Park in Sacramento, California, which has, when I bought this house 20 some odd years ago, there was a racial covenant on it. And which basically meant that my parents would not have been able to buy this house when I was growing up. So the racial covenant on the house says that the grantee, meaning the owner of the house, shall not have the right to sell, convey, or rent said premises to any person of the Black, brown, yellow, or yellow races. And this prevented Black people and other groups from getting home loans, not based on their being credit worthy, but based upon racism. So I wanted to point out that the implications and the impact of these government sanctioned housing discrimination had an impact not only on their housing, had an impact on their medical conditions and anything else, particularly that was economic, like, you know, the money to go to college and those sorts of things. So important for us to know that we are not where we are in society simply because people did not do the right thing or they don't work hard for, you know, in order to get ahead. We are where we are at this place in our history because the government set up a system that was unjust and unfair. And as we will talk, as I will continue to talk, we'll see how the government in some ways continues to support those unfair practices. Next slide, please. So this is where we are now. I'm going to address 5 factors that I believe maintain systemic racism without anyone seeming to notice. It's like, we don't need those blatant laws of exclusion to maintain the current status of disproportionality, disparities, or systemic racism. We can do it by just using these simple factors that can operate without anybody even noticing it. And the thing that's so interesting is, as we talk about this, you'll see that some of the recent legislation that has been passed all over the country, like book banning and the critical race theory, all those things are, you consider those things color blindness 2.0. It's to keep us from paying attention to how systemic racism works and how it's been sanctioned by the government. It's like in the 60s, we were well positioned to put racism and systemic racism behind us. We passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, but the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Fair Housing Act in 1968. I want you to know that those were my coming out of high school, going off to college years. I was ready. I was like, this is my time historically. But what we see is that we've had a total backlash. And we are still trying to dig our way out of this. So despite the passing of historic legislation designed to ensure equal rights to all, in the 58 years since, we have continued to reproduce the same patterns of exclusion based on that were once based on blatant and incontrovertible acts of discrimination. We can now do that through these 5 systems of implicit bias, stereotypes, color blindness, microaggressions, and the use of language. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that I've been using for many years now, but I like this slide because it's like a reminder that implicit bias isn't just about having a bad attitude. Our brain really activates when we have biases. And so we just need to acknowledge that sometimes our brain is activating in ways that we don't even realize. Next slide, please. So having a positive attitude towards a group does not mean that we don't have implicit biases. We can still like the culture of various groups, and we can still think that Blacks are dangerous or Latinos are undocumented. Next slide, please. Here's a video that we're going to watch briefly, and it will give us more information on implicit bias.
And the sound's not coming on.
Can everybody hear the video or not? I'm sorry, did it?
No, the sound's not coming on.
Okay. Okay, let me try it again. My apologies, everybody. Let me know, okay?
Okay.
Blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Thank you, Anne.
Okay.
We can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So the second, implicit bias is the first factor. We've talked about that and we saw the video. The second factor is stereotypes. And I'm going to spend a little bit more on this one because it's really important for us to understand. In 2020, the Kansas City Star, you remember all the apologies we heard from various systems and industries and organizations that were paying attention, probably for the first time, that they were acknowledging that they had biases. But I want to connect the dots between stereotypes and our beliefs about people. So if the Kansas City Star was saying through its sins of commission, how it basically contributed to the disparities for African-American people, when they were talking about Negroes and brutal crime, Negroes and killing, dangerous Negroes. Just think about how that narrative gets reinforced over and over and over again. And think about how by repeating that narrative over and over again, we start to believe it. And we start to make that association. That is precisely what what was happening to me when I was standing in the hallway looking at my student. I am a product of my environment. I have been socialized to see people who look like me. Even though I know better intellectually, I have been taught to see them in a certain particular way. And I have to constantly intervene against my own thinking. Next slide, please. So this slide, I want you to think about this. It's like, I love this, and I'm just going to read the bottom part. When we think about crime, we see Black, even when it's not present at all. In fact, Jennifer Eberhardt, in her book called Bias, she talks about the fact that when we think about crime, we think of Black. When we think of Black, we think about crime. And that reminded me of a report that I just saw recently. And like I said, the reports keep coming in. Some of you probably saw the one on the Black Panther director, Ryan Coogler, who was detained by the police in Atlanta in January after he was mistaken for a bank robber. While he was trying to cash a check or take a withdrawal. He wrote on the back of his withdrawal slip, he basically asked the teller, he said, "I would like to withdraw $12,000 cash from my checking account. Please do not count the money. Please count the money somewhere else. I'd like to be discreet." That's what the note said. The bank teller thought the note was like the note of somebody who was basically saying, hand over the money, I'm going to rob the bank. And so I want you to connect the dots between stereotypes that are reflected in this particular slide. When we think of Blacks, when we think of crime, we see Black, even when it's not present at all. That's precisely what happened in this case. And it happens, unfortunately, it happens all too often. Next slide, please. Or this slide, one is about a school study. I think it was, let me see, what grade? A preschool study, actually. And in this preschool study, the teachers were outfitted with eye scan technology, and they were told to identify the most challenging behaviors in the classroom. And after the teachers, gazed at the students over and over again, they didn't find any challenging behaviors. However, they found themselves looking at the Black boys, mostly focused on the Black boys. So this is a way that we can think about, if we are taught to see one group of kids as being the problem over and over again, we're going to look until we find the problem. And this is a way for us to really understand how the school to prison pipeline works. If we already have children being set aside in preschool as being the problem, then we know that this will possibly and likely, it does, continue in K through 12 education. And we see a higher suspension and expulsion rate for kids of color, particularly Black students. And we know that once kids are suspended or expelled, it increases the likelihood that they'll be involved in the youth justice system. And we know that once they're involved in the youth justice system, it increases the likelihood that they'll be in the criminal justice system. So there you have it. All right, so next slide, please. Just a little thought about how that school to prison pipeline works. So when we look at the stereotypes, particularly tying them back to what we saw during the coronavirus, during the pandemic, when we have people who are using language, particularly world leaders like Kung Flu, it perpetuates violence against groups of people. So, and we see this happening, it's still happening. The other thing I want to point out is that when it comes to stereotypes, and we often miss this one, but there's a study that's called the Missing White Women Syndrome. And when we talk about gender, I want to do an intersectionality between gender. race and gender. When white women go missing, the media is all over it. Yet we have an epidemic in this country of women of color missing, and particularly missing and murdered Indigenous women, a huge epidemic. And for white women, when they go missing or something happens, you know, the perceptions that they are positive, the perceptions of them are positive. They're perceived as being innocent and in need of protection. And people feel like, God, that could be my daughter. But Mary Johnson, who is an Indigenous woman, she was missing 10 months before Gabby Petito. I'm sure most of you remember that case from, I think it was sometime last year. And she had 6,000 search results, Mary Johnson, 6,000 search results, compared to Gabby Petito, who is a white woman. And within days of her going missing, there were 40 million results on Google. So again, to think about how stereotypes set people up, some people up in a way that make them look more positive, and other people in ways that make them look more culpable and dangerous. Next slide, please. And this slide is just for us to think about the bottom bullet point in particular. All around you, this group, when you think of white people, are paired to good things. And so the top bullet point is basically saying, we don't choose to make positive associations with the dominant group. It just happens. Next slide, please. Color blindness. Like I said earlier, color blindness is the new, it's been going on for 30 years now, this ideology of color blindness. But I want us to think about the fact that color blindness is a way for us to basically obscure white privilege as well. So recently we've had discussions about nominating a Black woman to the Supreme Court. This would be the 8th person in the Supreme Court's 233 history who is not a white man. And this woman, you know, some of the arguments about her is that adding a Black woman to the court, she would be a beneficiary of affirmative action. That's really interesting because we haven't worried about white men and, you know, any association with them in affirmative action, even though they occupied every Supreme Court seat, with the exception of 8 for over 233 years. Next slide, please. So what do we have going on in terms of this idea of colorblindness? Just a couple of things. You know, we started out with this idea of critical race theory. You know, we're saying, oh, we have to ban critical race theory because it's making people hate America. That's not what the argument was all about, by the way. Very few teachers even knew anything about critical race theory. You might touch on it in a college classroom, but they definitely were not teaching grade school kids critical race theory. Let's go to the next slide. This whole idea of critical race theory was a way to get people to stop talking about race. It was a way to get people to control what kind of discourse is happening about American culture. And certainly a lot of people didn't want people talking about race or systemic racism or implicit bias or any of the things that we're talking about right now. And subsequently, we've seen a huge increase in book banning across the country, which is basically controlling what students can read, controlling what students can teach. In Florida, we saw the passing of a don't say gay ban. So we're even controlling our ability to say gay, obviously disregarding the fact that there are 8.1 million LGBT workers age 16 and older in the United States. So I guess they can't talk about their lives. Next slide, please. Again, we have microaggressions, which is the 4th category. Microaggressions can happen in many sort of ways. So we're going to watch this video. I think that's next. We can go to the next slide. So just to say this before we go to the video, it's just a way that we can speak differently to people based on some biases that we might have. We could be less formal. We can be less impartial. And this is a study that was done by Jennifer Eberhardt when she was looking at how police officers speak to Black drivers. And so other people might say, it's particularly white people might say, well, those officers are so nice, but that may not be the same experience that I have. It's like, it may not be the same experience for many reasons. So let's look at this video on microaggressions and see what we can come up with.
Dan, it disappeared.
All rise.
So I'm sure you can see how the stereotypes that we have about people can shape and inform how we respond to them. So those stereotypes, even if we read a book, even if we have a best friend who's Black or who's a person of color or who's a woman of color, it doesn't mean that we no longer have biases about them. Those biases can be lodged in our brains. So I want you to just think about any microaggressions that you may have experienced. So this slide, I like to include this slide because it's really important for us to understand. Again, it's like how we've moved the historic forms of discrimination into the present. So the new Jim Crow is in reference to the historic Jim Crow era that we all know about, because the new Jim Crow is about the criminal justice system, because the criminal justice system, like the original Jim Crow system, controls where people live, where they work, if they can vote, being on parole, probation, or in custody. It's like disproportionately impact people of color, and in particular, Black men. Black men are admitted to prison on drug charges 20 to 50 times greater than white men. It's not, they don't commit 20 to 50 times more crimes, but their sentences are greater. And just having the label of felon alone is enough to impact a person's life in such a way that they are members of a permanent social caste system. In major cities, 80% of young Black men have criminal records. So you, as educators in workforce education, I'm sure have students who are in this situation as well. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from one of my colleagues in Michigan. He's a judge. I've worked with him a lot, and he sent me this statement on my personal email. He said, every time I visit a prison or a juvenile detention facility, I am struck by the obscenely disproportionate number of Black inmates that we have here in Michigan. Another school administrator in Texas, can't remember, Austin, I think. What he said was, students come to my school as they come as students, but they leave as felons. So again, we just have to think about how are we reproducing this cycle? You know, getting back to what I said earlier, we're reproducing this. How is it? Well, I went to one detention center and it was a very diverse community. Every single youth or student who was detained that day in that detention center, everyone was Black. And I'm like, how could this happen without somebody noticing it? How could this escape our notice? Next slide, please. And then this gives us an opportunity, this video, it's very short. I want you to think about, even when we are doing our best jobs as, you know, staff people or faculty in workforce education, our biases can get in our way. In this video, we will see how a storekeeper, a social worker, a teacher, a doctor, and bystanders, how their implicit biases affected the outcome of this child's life.
Good morning. How are you?
Cool.
So, can we talk about how you got here?
Yeah, you think I got a funny looking face? I just thought it was funny.
Hey, kids, I'm telling you, go right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Go right here before I'm called cops.
So, you didn't do anything?
Nope.
Then what's all this?
Depends on who's reading it, I guess.
Well, looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home? He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm gonna have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Well, I done told you them tricks were gonna put you in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him.
How you doing?
Hi.
It ain't fair.
Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends, too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
Like you just like everybody else. You think you see, but you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop.
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. And yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
Okay, so hopefully you could identify with what was happening with the storekeeper or the doctor or the social worker or the teacher or the bystander. Next slide, please. So let's apply this to the workplace. Some business leaders ask if diversity should be more important than merit, and the answer, we want to get diverse candidates. We want to do our part, but we absolutely can't let our quality of work or expectations suffer. I mean, that just goes to show you again how microaggressions work. Next slide, please. So language is number 5. So let's look at a couple of these. Stereotypical characteristics used in letters of recommendation for faculty positions can discriminate against women candidates because they often describe women as helpful, sympathetic, tactful, warm, and some very subjective affective characteristics, as opposed to, you know, more concrete terms of their abilities and their skills. Men are described with terms like independent, confident, outspoken, intellectually and ambitious, and that's okay for them. We also see biases in letters of recommendation, gender language. Next slide, please. So in one study, I want you to think about this as you read the slide. Just think about the fact that so very often the words that we choose are a reflection of the biases that we have or the stereotypes that we have in our heads. So when the person doing the shoving was Black, the victim was white, 75% of the participants rated this behavior as violent. But when the person doing the shoving was white with a Black victim, only 17% of students considered the shove as violent. And in fact, 42% of whites who shoved Blacks were deemed by students in the study to simply be just playing around. Next slide, please. So that was a lot, but I tried to identify the things that I thought were the most impactful for you to think about how systemic racism works. So for your going forward, it's like, you know, as at the end of that one video said, what you do next is what counts. If you haven't taken the Harvard Implicit Association test, we encourage you to please take it. Every day, conduct an audit. Just think about when you're in the grocery store, when you're driving down the street, it doesn't even matter. It's like if you are saying something that you're not sure about, later ask yourself, why did I say that? Why did I make that assumption? Why did I speak to that person that way? Just do a personal audit of your own personal and department and college outcomes to see if there are disparities. Colorblindness is not an anti-racist strategy. It's like, it's going to preserve racism. So in order to eliminate racism, we have to take account of race. Unintended bias is still bias. Our biases will be represented in the words that we use. and education should be the primary source, our primary source of information about racism. So keep teaching and doing the great work that you're doing. Thank you so very much. So just this last slide and the last bullet point, if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cameron Wedding. We have, looks like we have one question and Q&A. So if you have some questions, please either put them in chat. We've got chat open or a Q&A. So I'll start off with the first one. This question is, how does a person who has been a victim of aggression or violence from a minority race break the cycle of psychologically learned stress reaction and learn not to hold a single person's action against a race? Being aware that the stress and potential for bias is there, but what is the next step? That's a long question.
That's a very good question. And I'm sure that happens. I used to say in my trainings that given the history of racism that I and my family have experienced historically, and the trauma that I feel, the last training that we did for our institute, which was just a few weeks ago, I started my presentation in tears because a situation had just arisen as I was signing on, in which it was a parking dispute, and it involved my children and the fear that somebody was going to call the police. Not that they had done anything wrong. They were parking where we always park. But I was in a community that I felt, I felt some form of discrimination. So the trauma associated with that and the fear of what just calling the police, the consequences of that would have for my children, my grown, by the way, very grown, middle-aged children, but nonetheless, they're mine. It sticks with you, and it's hard to release yourself of that trauma. So for years, I used to talk about, it's amazing that I can still engage with white people, be married to a white person, have mixed race children. I have learned how to disassociate that trauma from the loved ones in my family who are white. I don't blame them. I don't blame all people. So, but I think it is work that we have to keep doing every day. And the other thing I would suggest is meet people, interact with people who are of different races so that you can have, more positive experiences that might overshadow that very horrible negative experience that you had. I hope that helps.
Thank you. We've got one more, and we have time for one more question. And the question is, because we know implicit bias exists, when we are helping students create their resumes for jobs, would you encourage them to cover or hide their race on their resumes? The example given is, a student wants to put Black Women in STEM Club on her resume, but she worries about being screened out for that job. Or a student considers changing their name on the resume to make it sound more white, only because he thinks the employer might screen him out for an interview due to implicit bias.
I'm sure that you heard, I should have muted myself because I was just, I never stop being amazed when I'm reminded of the hoops that we have to jump through to pretend like we're not who we are. It's like, it's just striking to me. I would be tempted to try to do something like that, but I think the long-term implications are more devastating to people when they can't acknowledge who they are. I have been tempted to do that. I think there are some cases with my own children when I've talked about hairstyles and I've asked them to please cut your dreadlocks. I mean, I'm not proud of that, but those were more extreme circumstances that the penalties were had greater consequences or different consequences. But what I would encourage a student to do, and I used to work in career development, I would encourage them, if they have an opportunity to write a cover letter, to, talk about how amazing my experiences has been in the STEM program and the successes that I bring to you as a result of that experience. If I could find a way to overshadow any potential negative, thinking around that or biases, I would try to find a way to do that. But I would not at this point in our history. I hope I would not. I hope I would not. I'm not perfect. Because I know how those biases can show up in very tricky ways, but I think it does harm to our souls when we are complicit in our own discrimination, almost against our own selves.
Mm-hmm. And Christine made an offer in chat. She suggests mentoring someone completely different from yourself.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So we're quickly running out of time, unfortunately. We always wish we had more time with these webinars, particularly with Dr. Cameron Wedding. So first, I want to thank you, Dr. Cameron Wedding. As always, we've had the pleasure and privilege of working with you for a number of years now, and the learning never stops. I mean, it's always a treat to work with you. And despite the difficult topic, it's always fun to work with you. And I think that's really important to share with everybody. But,
we work really hard at it, don't we, Ann?
We do.
Yeah.
We've like you said, we find the smiles.
Yes.
We absolutely do. A couple of things. Kim posted in chat the link to the survey. So if you could please take a couple of moments and complete the survey. Your inputs mean a lot to us. It really does help us in planning in this project. We're going to send out the link to the video. We're going to also send everybody the resource guide, and we will send out, and then the links to all the videos. I think I already said that. So thank you all so very much. Thank you, Dr. Rita Cameron Wedding. Thank you to the planning team, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Okay, do we have, let's see. Rita, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Awesome.
You stop recording, Ann.
I'm trying to find it.
I'm going to stop it. I see it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.